Set to put us up to speed in terms of the latest in the markets, economic movements. Arabile, very good morning and welcome to you.
Yeah, good morning to you guys.
Are the markets excited about the improvement in the rand?
Well, I think everybody generally is, right? But the question becomes whether it's rand strength or dollar weakness. That's actually the general question that happens in the market. And I suppose right now you take a look at it and probably say that it's US weakness. Let's remember that the trade talks that seem to be happening and the trade tariff issues between China and the United States are beginning to weaken a little bit the sentiment around the United States. That economy is getting better and better, but these tariffs themselves are things that are probably going to affect a lot more items. Local people from the United States themselves are going to struggle with regards to just how much they can afford as well. And that is bearing down on sentiment, certainly. So that might be the issue. Locally, however, it isn't as if the greatest amount of news has come through in order to really push the rand to the current levels of around 13 rand and 33 cents against the US dollar.
President Cyril Ramaphosa visiting 3 countries, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We import a lot of our petroleum products from Nigeria. I think about 47% of oil from Saudi Arabia. We're currently experiencing fuel hikes here in South Africa. What is the president's game plan here visiting these countries? What do you read into that? One
would say that he perhaps should have also visited Iran at some point, because that is going to be one to look out for, considering the United States who might be an imposition on Iran and its imports, which means that we may not want to take oil out of them as well. So that becomes a big issue too. But I think out of these 3 countries, as you said, oil exporting nations, and the hope is to get investment out of them. But who knows, that push for oil particularly might be a really great one. Let's remember that exports to Saudi Arabia have risen from around 2.3 billion in 2013 to around 4.4 billion in 2017. So there is a greater investment that we're seeing coming through from Saudi Arabia in South Africa, a belief that our goods are worth having in that nation as well. So I think those developments are really key for South Africa. And of course, the two biggest economies in Africa is certainly quite key to having discussions sort of continue to go on between those two, which were really severed before.
We've spoken a lot about developments at VBS Bank, but with 22,000 depositors, is it really an impactful economic story, or is it just the governance angle that should be important?
I think anything that highlights risk within South Africa's banking sector is very critical. You have 22,700 plus minus odd people who are, in need of receiving their funds. The South African Treasury, backed as well, of course, by the Reserve Bank, saying that they'll back up to around 100,000 rand per depositor, per retail depositor. The municipal ones are going to be something to deal with a little bit later. I think the essence here is to really question whether there is systemic risk within the entire system. This is the second bank in about 4 or 5 years or so to actually be under business, well, not necessarily business rescue, but having a curator and being under curatorship. But let's remember that the first one was a systemic risk within itself. The second one is mainly because of fraud and malpractice, and that becomes an issue all on its own. So I suppose it's a problem, but it isn't one that's going to spread wide into the rest of the banking sector in and of itself.
Let's move on to another story that's in the headlines. The Human Rights Commission just releasing the inequality report, which I guess continues to paint a bleak picture about inequality in South Africa.
Look, you don't need the Human Rights Commission report to really tell you the story of inequality in South Africa, right? Gender pay in itself has become a big topical issue. It's not something that you need to look at, recent research for to ask yourself whether it's a problem in South Africa. The issue, however, is how exactly is it being tackled? Because there seems to be great conversation around it, but nothing of substance seems to be put together. We have all these commissions, all these reports that come out that tell you exactly how the situation looks in South Africa, but there doesn't seem to be a hard graft on the surface to say we're actually going to change this. There's that, and the fact that you get to upper management and pay for executives seems to have just ballooned out of control. So perhaps the bonus and incentive schemes need to be something that's looked out for as well. PwC in themselves releasing a report yesterday as well, detailing just how you may need to relook at how that process is done in order to help South Africa's corporate governance as well moving forward.
Arabile, which other business stories were driving business sentiment this week that were under the radar?
Well, mining and manufacturing data come out, and those are key symbols of just how South Africa's economy is doing. Manufacturing surprising as well to the upside. That occupies around 12 or 13% of South Africa's GDP. So that's a big chunk of our GDP, and that contribution is quite necessary. So it's surprising to the upside is great, but at 2.5% still doesn't dent anything. It still doesn't help the sector in and of itself. We saw a massive drawdown in GDP in the first quarter of the year. The second quarter is looking as likely as well, and I guess the fears here are that we get into the big R word of a recession, right? But let's call it what it is. We're already in one. You know, if you have growth, as I've said before, if you have growth of the population at around 1.3, 1.5%, and you only have GDP growth of 1.3%, you haven't grown the economy, and you really are going backwards in any sense. Of course, with all the increases, everything from VAT, petrol and the like, that speaks its own volumes. Look, there generally isn't any, right, looking around. But the one thing I can say, however, is that South Africa's economy has been resilient for many years. And that is the case right now as well. The South African Reserve Bank in itself next week on Thursday will be announcing interest rates or whether there's any change to interest rates. And at this stage, it does look that they'll perhaps keep things as they are. It will depend on the inflation outlook for the remainder of the year, but Wednesday's number coming out of CPI should be very interesting as well out of Stats SA.
Arabile, thank you very much indeed for your insight. That was our economics reporter, Arabile Gumede there. Well,